The book of Romans answers some of the most important questions that we have about life, particularly our own lives, like what was my spiritual condition before my conversion? What did God do in Jesus Christ, his son, to save me from that condition? And how was that work that he did different from what God has done inside of me? How did God overcome my stubborn resistance and give me the gift of faith? And now, how should I live in light of the precious salvation God has given to me and is working inside of me now? How does it affect my relationships, my work, my life at home, in the church, and in the world? And what confident hope can I have for the future? Paul's letter to the Romans is such a precious gift from God, answering all of these questions for us. Pastor John, as we approach March and prepare to dive into Romans in our Bible reading and to read it throughout this month, help us out here. You've been reading and studying and cherishing this book, this letter, for over 60 years now. What advice would you give us to help us draw out the most glories from this precious letter?
Let me see if I can raise the expectations of us all as we move into Romans again this year. I will claim without any fear of contradiction that Paul's letter to the Romans is the greatest letter that has ever been written in the history of the world by anybody, Christian or non-Christian. And here's what I mean by greatest. 3 things. Number 1, it is the fullest, divinely inspired summary of the greatest realities in the universe. Second, among those inspired writings, it is not only the fullest summary of the greatest realities, it penetrates more deeply into those realities than any other book does, like the condition of humanity outside Christ, the meaning of justification by faith, the miracle of the Christian life lived after the law in the Spirit, the condition of the natural world under the fall, the future destiny of the people of Israel, the mystery of why God would prepare vessels of wrath for destruction. Things like that. It's just unparalleled in its penetrating power. And third, what I mean by greatest, is no other letter has had a greater impact on the history of the church and the world than this one. Augustine traced his conversion to Romans 13:13. Martin Luther entered the paradise of imputed righteousness and freedom through the portal of Romans 1:17. And John Wesley's heart was freed from the strivings of the Oxford Club into the joy of faith by hearing the Moravians read Luther's preface to the Romans. And millions upon millions of others have walked into peace with God along what we call the Romans road, namely Romans 3:23, all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Romans 6:23, the wages of that sin is death. Romans 5:6, while we were still weak, Christ died for the ungodly. Romans 10:9, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Goodness, how many millions of people have heard those 4 glorious and painful and wonderful truths and been saved by God.
Yes.
It's the greatest letter that has ever been written. And we should enter the front door of Romans this year with a sense of wonder and reverence and thankfulness and expectation and joy. It's not just the Mount Everest of Scripture, which it is a whole range of mountain peaks of soaring revelation. If there's any Scripture to which we should apply Psalm 119, verse 18, this is it. O Lord, open my eyes that I may behold wonderful things out of your instruction. That's a good translation of Torah, sometimes translated law.
Yeah.
So with this sense of expectation, and wonder and reverence and thankfulness for the greatest of all books, is there a peculiar angle from which we should come at this book as we read it this year? Well, I'm very hesitant to limit anybody's approach to this book. It is without exaggeration an ocean. It's an ocean of insight into reality, and the ocean has no bottom, and the ocean has no shores, which means that this book will never be exhausted by finite human beings in what it has to show us about God and his ways and about his world and his people. But if anybody listening to us would like a suggestion, here's mine. I would dare to say that no believer fully understands who he is and what God did to make us believers who we are and what we will become. I would venture to say that most Christians have an incomplete and many even defective grasp of what happened to make them a Christian and the miraculous thing it is to be a Christian. Therefore, my suggestion is that many of us read Romans, ransack Romans this year for 3-4 weeks, however long we're in it, to find the answer to 5 questions. First, what was my condition before conversion to Christ? Or which is a form of the same question, what would be my condition now if God had not powerfully moved in my life to save me? We must let God answer this question from Romans, not from our experience. Some of us were saved when we were 6 years old, and we don't have any memory at all of what our condition was before we were saved. And some of us think we know how bad we were because of the bad things we did before we were saved, but we don't realize how bad we were because deep down the analysis of our condition and our corruption is so much more profound than any experience could teach us. We must be taught by God what our condition was and would be today if we weren't saved, or we won't be singing Amazing Grace the way we should. Second question we should try to answer. What did God do in Jesus Christ in history to save me from that condition? Now, let's not confuse that question with what God did in me. Martin Luther's whole world was turned upside down when he realized that his salvation was accomplished outside of him. He called it extra nos. I remember the first time in seminary I heard that phrase, and it landed on me similarly with power. Extra nos, outside of us. Centuries ago, on a hill outside Jerusalem, it was done. The salvation was achieved. The decisive divine work was done before Luther existed, you existed, I existed. What did God do outside of us to save us in eternity, in history? Romans is really good on that. Let's answer that question, because we need to know what he did for us, outside of us, thousands of years ago, before we ever existed, not just what he does in us. Third question, what then did God do in us to save us? What does he do to us by his Spirit and his sovereign grace? How was my resistance to him overcome? How did that happen? How did my faith come into being? What was that like? If the mind of the flesh is hostile to God and cannot submit to God's law, chapter 8, verse 7, how did I get saved? The glory of God's grace that we find in the Bible is so powerful and decisive that we stop attributing things to ourselves which the Bible attributes to God. Fourth question I hope we can answer this year. How then shall I live in this world if I was saved like that? How shall I live in this church? How shall I live with my enemies? How shall I live in relation to the government? in relation to unreached peoples of the world. Chapter 10, by what power can I live the Christian life? How am I to gain that power? How am I to defeat sin? How to live the Christian life? Last question, number 5. What is my future? What's my future in this life? What kind of care does God take of me in this life as I walk in the Spirit? What is my future forever? Those are my 5 questions. Now, I don't want to limit anybody's insights as you read Romans. God has things for you to see besides these 5 questions, I am sure. So one way to do both, let God say whatever he wants to say besides these, and to do this ransacking for these 5 answers, is to get a notebook or a few sheets of paper and put these 5 questions on 5 different pages. And then just as you read, I think that the sections we're going to read are fairly short. Just stay alert to these 5 questions. And every time you see something that relates to one of them, jot it down on that particular page while he shows you all kinds of other things as well. Let God speak to you any way he pleases, and don't fret that you can't see it all. Depending on how old you are, you can read it maybe another 100 times, and there will always be more to see.
The greatest letter that has ever been written in the history of the world by anybody, Christian or non-Christian. Wow. Thank you, Pastor John. And thanks for joining us today. If you have a question to ask Pastor John, find a link to email us and find our complete episode archive at askpastorjohn.com. Every episode with audio and full transcripts available for you 24/7. Speaking of Romans, there's a dilemma faced by a young woman who wants to know what it means to have been an enemy of God before conversion, especially for Bethany, who was raised in a Christian home and has no conscious memory of such enmity against God. The issue is whether we should rely on personal experiences and memories to understand the realities of our sinful condition. It's a great question from Bethany. It's up next time. I'm Tony Reinke. We'll see you on Monday.